What's an apocalypse? Well, I'm not talking about the end times. I mean, who knows, they might be around the corner, but it's generally a bad idea to predict them. What's an apocalypse? An apocalypse is a revelation. It's why the last book of the Bible is called the Book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of St. John. The word apocalypse is Greek, and it simply means something is revealed which was previously hidden. A veil is torn away, something is removed, and you can see things which were already there, but were hidden. So if you're living in an apocalyptic time, you're living in a time in which things which were previously hidden are being revealed. And this is what Yeats' poem is about. Now, Yeats is a poet. He's also a prophet and a mystic. All the great poets are prophets and mystics. That's why nobody listens to them. Now, this poem was written after Yeats had moved into his tower house in Thor Valley Lee, which is in County Galway, not far from where I live now. And it's a beautiful place. It's a Norman tower house attached to a little thatched cottage next to the river, which regularly floods, unfortunately. And Yeats had moved in there with his wife, George. And Yeats, of course, is mystic. Yeats is involved in the Golden Dawn and all sorts of other strange things. And just after he moves in, his wife, George, starts doing these automatic writing sessions. She starts writing things down, these words are coming through, and she claims they're being channeled through her. And they do this together. They have these sessions every evening. This automatic writing comes through. And Yeats puts this all together into a book called A Vision, which is a very strange book. It's not poetry, it's Yeats's kind of mystical vision of the shape of the universe. And it's in A Vision that you find this image of the Gaia, which is right at the beginning of this poem, turning and turning in the widening Gaia. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. And he even illustrates this in the book. So a Gaia to Yeats is an era in time. So what you have is, if you imagine a tiny little circle and it's turning around, it's turning and turning there, and it moves forward in time like this. And as it moves forward in time, it widens. It widens and widens, turning and turning in the widening Gaia. So as the time moves on, the Gaia widens, and it starts to look like a kind of giant ice cream cone on its side. And these Gaias, according to Yeats, they last about 2,000 years. They're historical eras. And they widen, and they widen, and they widen until they get so wide that they are, to use the currently fashionable word, unsustainable. Okay, the Gaia cannot hold together. This side of the Gaia here is in no contact with this side of the Gaia here. What started off as a small culture, as a small civilization, as a small way of seeing, has become so big and so unwieldy that it can't hold together. And the falcon cannot hear the falconer. And things fall apart, and the center cannot hold, and anarchy is loosed upon the world. And according to Yeats, this is a picture of historical cycles. It's just the way things are. And as this Gaia gets so big that it starts to collapse in on itself, we're looking at the end of an age, the end of a culture, the end of an era. But as that happens, at the point where the Gaia is widest, in the middle begins a very, very small turning of the new Gaia that's to be born, and it starts going backwards in the other direction. So in the seeds of the collapse of this Gaia, this time, a new Gaia is born. And Yeats writes this in A Vision. He says, at the present moment, the life Gaia is sweeping outward, unlike that before the birth of Christ, which was narrowing. It's almost reached its greatest expansion. The revelation which approaches will take its character from the contrary movement of the interior Gaia. That's the new one that's beginning as this one gets big and collapses. All our scientific, democratic, fact-accumulating, heterogeneous civilization belongs to the outward Gaia. That's the one that we're at the end of. And it prepares not the continuance of itself, but the revelation, as in a lightning flash, of the civilization that must slowly take its place. So what Yeats is saying 100 years ago is we are at the end of a time. We're at the end of an era. Things can't hold anymore, and something new is being born. And Yeats actually said this was going to really start to kick off at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, at the time, just after the First World War, there were a fair number of other writers saying similar things, from René Guénon to Oswald Spengler, a lot of people talking about the decline of the West and the end of time, from the end of civilizations and cycles. So what this meant, what Yeats meant, is that the age of the machine, as I call it, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more here, the age of materialism and control was going to hit limits everywhere. And it was going to start to come down. Yeah, come in. And this quest that we have had for so long to kind of defeat God and take his place was going to end in tears. Now, I've been writing for the last year or so about this thing I call the machine, which is really a poetic way of describing the civilization, the society we're living in, this great web of technology and power and control. And it's not my word, it's a word I stole from better writers than me, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it manifests in the world we're living in today, which is coming apart. Ecological control, technocratic control, economic globalization, the triumph of mass society, this great control mechanism that we're all caught within, like flies in a web. There's a reason they call it the web and the net, by the way. Nikolai Berdyaev, the orthodox Russian philosopher, described a society like this, and this again is from about a century ago. He says, the will to power, to well-being, and to wealth triumphs over the will to holiness and to genius. Spirituality is on the wane. In a time of bourgeois ascendancy, the knight and the monk, the philosopher and the poet have been superseded by a new type, the greedy bourgeois conqueror, organizer, and trader. In the new machine-made industrial capitalist civilization of Europe and America, the spiritual culture, based on a sacred symbolism and a sacred tradition, is being irrevocably annihilated. That's what the machine does. That's what happens at the end of this Gaia, this 2,000-year-long era of civilization that Yeats identifies with control and machinery and science and factual accumulation, as he calls it. And this is where we are now. We're heading very rapidly into a world in which it will be entirely normal to implant chips under your skin, or as I heard Bill Gates telling us this week, to get a digital tattoo on your skin, which will be able to replace your smartphones and will be able to connect you personally through your body to the internet. We're looking forward to that. Mass digital monitoring is the norm. Both nature and human nature are denied and rebuilt from the cellular level upwards, so that we can build a new world in our image instead of in God's image. Better than the one we inherited, of course. So that's what I call the machine. It's like a war against nature. It's the rebellion against God. Now, I thought for a while that there's a culture, if you like, is a manifestation of a spiritual belief. There's a throne at the heart of every culture, if you like, and something sits on that throne, someone sits on that throne. And all over the world, throughout history, in different cultures and different civilizations, some manifestation of God has sat on that throne. And the West was formed when Christ sat on that throne, and we built what was a Christian civilization here. And that's where our values still come from, whether we know it or not. Now, if you dethrone God, if you take whoever is your manifestation of the divinity off that throne, something else is going to come and sit on it. Someone else is going to come and sit on it, because you're always going to worship something. If you're not worshipping God, who are you worshipping? Or what are you worshipping? Which is, I think, the question for us today. Now, Marx, of course, famously said that religion is the opium of the people. G.K. Chesterton replied to Marx like this. He said, the truth is, irreligion is the opium of the people. Wherever the people do not believe in something beyond the world, they will worship the world. But above all, they will worship the strongest thing in the world. And I think that the strongest thing in the world perhaps is self. Or perhaps today the strongest thing in the world is the machine, it's the wires and the chips. Smartphone in your pocket. Perhaps that's the thing we worship, even though we tell ourselves we're in control of it, and we know at some level that it's in control of us. But in the triumph of all of this are the seeds of the fall of all of this and the beginning of something new. Just as the Gaia collapses, something new is born, so small and so quiet that you can't even really sense it at the time. In the seeds of this enormous control system that we're building around us are the seeds of its own collapse, if you like, and then the rebirth of something else. We have been behaving like we are gods, or as the Silicon Valley hero Stuart Brand put it, we are as gods, so we might as well get good at it. It's like the 21st century litany, if you like, but St. Paul reminded us God is not mocked. And the alarm klaxons are going off everywhere. The climate is changing, the forests are falling, the seas are polluted, the food is poisoned, the economies are shaking, the culture is disintegrating. It doesn't look like a great success to me, what's happening. And it doesn't look like it's going to get any better either. I want to read you another poem because I like to read poems. And this one is from another mystic poet, another prophetic poet, from maybe a little bit later in the 1930s. This is D.H. Lawrence. And if you take nothing else from this talk, it should be that you should go out and read more D.H. Lawrence. In fact, if you just put a load of D.H. Lawrence books on your shelf, you don't really need anything else. Lawrence is the kind of mystical prophet of the machine age. So this is Lawrence's poem called The Triumph of the Machine. They talk of the triumph of the machine, but the machine will never triumph. Out of the thousands and thousands of centuries of man, the unrolling of ferns, white tongues of the acanthus lapping at the sun, for one sad century, machines have triumphed, rolled us hither and thither, shaking the lark's nest till the eggs have broken, shaken the marshes till the geese have gone, and the wild swans flown away, singing the swan song at us. Hard, hard on the earth the machines are rolling, but through some hearts they will never roll. The lark nests in his heart, and the white swan swims in the marshes of his loins, and through the wide prairies of his breast a young bull herds his cows, lambs frisk among the daisies of his brain. And at last, all these creatures that cannot die, driven back into the uttermost corners of the soul, will send up the wild cry of despair. The thrilling lark in a wild despair will trill down arrows from the sky. The swan will beat the waters in rage, white rage of an enraged swan. Even the lambs will stretch forth their necks like serpents, like snakes of hate against the man in the machine. Even the shaking white poplar will dazzle like splinters of glass against him. And against this inward revolt of the native creatures of the soul, mechanical man in triumph, seated on the seat of his machine, will be powerless, for no engine can reach into the marshes and depths of a man. So mechanical man in triumph, seated upon the seat of his machine, will be driven mad from within himself and sightless. And on that day, the machines will turn to run into one another. Traffic will tangle up in a long, drawn-out clash of collision, and engines will rush at the solid houses. The edifice of our life will rock in the shock of the mad machine, and the house will come down. And then, far beyond the ruin, in the ultimate remote places, the swan will lift up again his flattened, smitten head and look round and rise, and on the great vaults of his wings will sweep around and up to greet the sun with a silky glitter of a new day, and the lark will follow trilling, angerless again, and the lambs will bite off the heads of the daisies for very friskiness. But over the middle of the earth will be the smoky ruin of iron, the triumph of the machine. Isn't that good? That is so good. I'd like to read that another 5 times, but I won't. But you should. You should actually go and read that, and a lot of other Lawrence poems too. So I think we are living through the triumph of the machine, which is also the collapse of the machine, as mechanical man is driven mad and sightless. That's probably us. And I've been writing about this for a long time, and I've particularly been asking, how as a human do we live through this? And now I find myself asking a sort of a variant of that question, which is, how as a Christian do I live through that? And what does Christianity have to say about it? And how do I understand that, if you like? Now, it's not a question I expected to ask. I didn't ever expect to be a Christian. I didn't want to be a Christian. I didn't plan to be a Christian. I didn't think I liked Christians, sorry. Didn't think I liked Christianity because I didn't know anything about it. And despite having been brought up in England, which at the time at least was nominally a Christian country. But I ended up a Christian 2 or 3 years ago, and I ended up being charismated and baptized into the Orthodox Church just over a year ago. And that was the end point of a long spiritual quest I'd been on for a long time, which took me through Buddhism and all sorts of pagan things and mythological quests and various confusions of the kind that many of us go through where we're seeking. And I ended up here. I was hunted, actually. I was hunted by Christ. He wouldn't leave me alone. And in the end, rather like C.S. Lewis, I had to, how did he put it? He said I had to face the reality of meeting him who I so feared to meet. That's usually how it works, I think. Since I wrote about this, a lot of other Christians have written to me and said, yeah, that happened to me too. So it turns out this is sort of common. So here I am, and I'm a Christian, and I say to myself, how do I look at these times in this way? What does it mean? And as I ask that question, I would ask you please to remember I'm a very new Christian. I'm an inexperienced one. I'm not a theologian, not a priest. I have no authority. You can't sue me. Please don't. It's a journey, and I'm at the beginning of it. So I'm trying to stand here with humility and say that everything I say comes from a very new understanding of what's going on here. And as I said, when you have 2,000 years of tradition at your back, it's very hard to get up to speed on it anyway. Now, when I was younger, I thought that Christianity, like all monotheisms, was a bad thing. It was part of this problem of this destructive, abusive civilization that seems to be wrecking the earth itself. I I thought that Christianity, of course, was hierarchical and oppressive and rigid and full of empty dogma and complicit in oppression and lies and violence and colonialism. And furthermore, that religion in general was irrational nonsense, which had been superseded by science. Now we had Richard Dawkins, we didn't need the Pope, etc. In other words, it was part of the problem. Christianity and religion generally, especially the traditional religions, was all part of the kind of the problem we have with this top-heavy civilization. Now, I don't think, now that I am a Christian, that I want to get too defensive about this. I don't want to deny some of the truths in the caricature, actually. I don't want to deny some of the oppression and the horrors that Christianity has been involved in at all. The uncomfortable fact is that it's been involved in a lot of them. And the uncomfortable fact, too, is that what I'm calling this machine society, if you like, has in some way grown from a Christian seedbed here in the West, right? So I don't know why that is, but I know that you can't serve God and mammon. That's very clear. And so I think that very often in the past, the Christian West, and maybe the Christian world too often, has tried to do both of those things. Tried to serve God and mammon, become far too close to power, and become complicit in the abuses of power. I really don't think Christianity and power mix very well. You have to be very careful with it. There's maybe no alternative to it, but you have to be very careful with it. And maybe that's a problem for all religions anywhere. It's hardly unique to Christianity, is it? But it's a human problem. As soon as we try to tie up the spiritual with the worldly, some rot enters. It's very difficult. And it's not as if plenty of Christians haven't pointed out the dangers of this in the past. Here's a quote from the 17th century Christian English mystic Thomas de Hearne, very interesting man. And he was talking about what he saw as the hypocrisy of Christian civilization at the time when people were out there colonizing other lands, supposedly in the name of Christ. And he said this: nothing is so easy as to teach the truth, because the nature of the thing confirms the doctrine. As when we say, the sun is glorious, or a man is a beautiful creature, or the stars minister unto us, etc. But to say, this house is mine, or these lands are another man's, or this bauble is a jewel, or this gewgaw is a fine thing, it's deadly barbarous and uncouth to a little child, and it makes him suspect all you say, because the nature of the thing contradicts your words. And this does blot out all noble and divine ideas, and render him uncertain in all things, and divide him from God. By this you may see who are the rude and barbarous Indians, for verily there is no savage nation under the cope of heaven that is more absurdly barbarous than the Christian world. There's a Christian. So this, I think, is where much of this critique of Christianity comes from. It's really a critique of a certain type of civilization, a certain type of overpowering, mechanical, oppressive civilization, which is unnatural and top-heavy and overdeveloped, and is even now engaged in the project of wrecking much of the earth for the supposed benefits of growth and progress. And there were always those who could see that, actually. And again, always Christians who could see that. I came across a really interesting quote a few years back from a Native American historian, a man called Ohiesa, whose anglicized name was Charles Eastman, and he was I'm not sure which tribe he was a member of, but he was a Christian as well, voluntarily, not forcibly. He wrote an autobiography. In fact, he was, I think, the first Native American historian to go to an American university and write the history of his own peoples. And he wrote an autobiography called The Soul of the Indian in 1910. And he wrote this: Christianity and modern civilization are opposed and irreconcilable. And the spirit of Christianity and our ancient religion is effectively the same. Interesting, quite a claim. Christianity and modern civilization are opposed and irreconcilable, and the spirit of Christianity and our ancient religion is essentially the same. Ooh, like I say, it's quite a claim. Now, that thing I just dropped on the floor, I found this in the dining room about 20 minutes ago, and it's got a picture of another Native American Christian on the back, Nicholas Black Elk. Some of you have probably heard of. Fascinating man. He was a Lakota medicine man and holy man. Became a Catholic teacher, again, voluntarily, but he made him do that because he saw the same thing that Ohiesa saw, which is the spirit of the religion that he'd had, the religion of his people had, and the spirit of Christianity was the same. Not the same faith, not the same theology, but the same spirit. And he became a Catholic teacher. And it's got a little prayer on the back, a prayer of Nicholas Black Elk. I'm going to just read it because it backs up the same point. Native American Catholic prayer. Grandfather, great sacred one, you have been always, and before you nothing has been. There is nothing to pray to but you. The star nations all over the universe are yours, and yours are the grasses of the earth. Day in and day out, you are the life of things. You are older than all need, older than all pain and prayer. Grandfather, all over the world, in the faces of the living ones are alike. In tenderness, they have come up out of the ground. Look upon your children with children in their arms, that they may face the winds and walk the good road to the day of quiet. Teach me to walk the soft earth, a relative to all that live. Sweeten my heart and fill me with light, and give me the strength to understand and the eyes to see. Help me, for without you, I am nothing. Amen. It's a lovely prayer, isn't it? So I think that this critique of Christianity is a confusion between Christianity and a certain type of culture. Some types of Christianity have been associated with. And the more I started to look into what Christianity actually taught and what it actually said and what the teachings were, the more I started to see this and the more I started to understand something. And the story that always particularly grabbed me, intrigued me, and fascinated me was the story of the fall. Now, again, I'm not a theologian, but there's something about this that happens every day, right? I have a friend, Martin Shaw, who's a storyteller, who recently has become a Christian as well, funnily enough. He's also been hunted. Some of you know him. Martin's a wonderful storyteller, tells traditional stories from different cultures, and he always says, at the end of a story, he wraps it up and he says, all of this is happening inside of you all of the time. A lovely way to think of it. And I think about that with the fall. All of this is happening inside of us all of the time. It's not just an event in time, it's a description of what we do. And so I see this primeval garden, which is a mountain, actually, isn't it? With rivers coming down from it. And it has a wall around it. And it's a paradise. And the word paradise comes from an Arabic word, paradisa, I think it's Arabic, which means a walled garden, a walled enclosure. The walled garden is walled in to keep the animals in, I think, rather than and to protect them from what might come and get them from outside. So you have a wall around your paradise. And you have a mountain, you have a sacred hierarchy. And you have the rivers coming down from the mountain, and everything here is all there. Everything's there. God is there. You can see God walking past you, so close. And all the animals are there, and all the trees are there, and the humans are there. Everything talking to everything else. It's a communion. Everything that lives is a communion. And there are two trees in the garden, aren't there? There's the tree of life, and there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God says, look, you see that one? You just don't touch that one. Okay? Now, we all know what happens, don't we, when we're told not to touch something, but God says, look, don't touch that because you're not ready for that yet, because humans are the newest things in the garden. They're created last, which incidentally is something that Christianity and the theory of evolution can agree on, because we're a very young species and we're not ready yet for this knowledge, because you don't give teenagers the car keys and a pint of pochine, do you? Right? You don't give them these things until they're ready, and we're not ready. At some point, where I think, as I understand it, designed to become a bridge between the rest of creation and God himself through our heart. We're designed to be that, to fulfill this vital role in creation, to speak to it, to steward it, to manage it for God and to connect to God as we do that. But we're not ready for that when we're created. So we're not to eat that apple, we're not to eat that fruit, because the knowledge of good and evil will be something that separates us from everything else that lives. And of course we listen to the snake, don't we? Of course we listen to the snake, because the snake tells us that we should individuate. The snake tells us that we should be our best self and that we're worth it, and so that we should eat this fruit, and God hasn't got our best interests at heart. And the appeal there is, you don't need God, you can do it yourself, you can do it better. You can take the knowledge of the good and evil and you can use it to run the world your own way. You don't have to wait for permission. And so that's what we do. And the first thing we do when we eat the fruit is we can see that we have nothing on, because we've suddenly become self-aware, because we've suddenly become separate from everything else. And at that point, that knowledge of who we are as a separate thing means that we can't stay. We have to leave the garden. We have to go out beyond the wall, and the angel with the flaming sword is set up, and we can't go back in anymore. We can never be in communion with God and the rest of creation again. And we can't fulfill our destiny that we were supposed to fulfill, because we got greedy. And the story in the Orthodox Church, anyway, as I understand it, happy to be corrected, as I'm sure I will be by my priest if he watches this, is that Christ is the second Adam. Christ comes to rescue us and to reset things, okay? There's a great Orthodox icon of the harrowing of hell after the crucifixion. Christ is down in hell and the gates of hell are busted open and the devil is chained on the floor and he's grabbing Adam and Eve by their wrists and he's pulling them out of the tomb because that's the second chance that everybody has. Christ is the new Adam and perhaps Mary is the new Eve. So we have this way back to the garden which is provided for us through the crucifixion and the resurrection. We have a chance to go home because what we fell into was ourself, into the material realm, into the separate self. We fell away from a heart connection to God. This is how I understand it. So, as I say, I think this happens within all of us all the time. And we fall into agriculture. We fall into backbreaking work. We fall into pain in childbirth. We fall into death, and so does everything else that lives. In the beginning of that, what Cain and Abel get us into is they become herders and gatherers and agriculturalists as they begin the process of civilization, which leads us through the Tower of Babel and the digital implants on your wrists. It's the same story, actually. The story of us trying to build the world ourselves, I think. So then the question for me was, okay, so what does Christianity have to offer here? What's the story it tells us that's a different story to this? If that's what the fall was, that's who we are. If we're fallen now, but we have a way home, what is it? And I'm really interested in the fact that Christianity, in the early years, in the early centuries of the church, was not called Christianity. The early Christians, who didn't call themselves Christians, they called themselves children of light, which I love. We should reclaim that. Children of light. The path wasn't Christianity, it was the way. That's what we call it. This is the way. This is what Christ comes. He comes to show you the way, which is the way home. It's the way back to God, who's waiting. Like he waits for the prodigal son. He's waiting with his arms open. He just wants you to come home, but you have to make that decision yourself. So the question is what that path looks like. What do you have to do? This is the bit I was trying to avoid, actually. So I thought I'd just write a lot of essays about the fall and avoid the actual bit of actually doing it, following the path. Because I'm much better at talking than doing. You can ask my family, who are in the back row, so you can literally ask them. So what do you have to do? And one answer comes from this passage from the book of Matthew, which I'm going to read to you in this great new translation of the New Testament from David Bentley Hart, which is very good. David Bentley Hart is an American Orthodox theologian, and he went right back to the original Greek text, and he tried to get as literal a translation as he could. And he explains in his introduction it's impossible to get literally right back to the original text because there are various different versions of them, but he's trying to get to the fruit of the literal translation of what early Christians would have read. It's a very stark, interesting book, actually, an interesting translation. I really recommend it. So this is the story of famous story of the rich young man, isn't it? In Gospel of Matthew. So, and look, they all begin like that, these texts in this translation. And look, someone approaching him said, "Teacher, what good thing may I do in order that I may have the life of the age?" And he said to him, "Why do you question me concerning the good? Only one there is who is good. But if you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments." He says to him, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor father and mother, and love your neighbor as yourself." The young man says to him, "All of these I have kept. What am I still lacking?" Jesus said to him, "If you wish to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you shall have a treasury in the heavens, and come follow me." But the young man, hearing the counsel, went away in sorrow, for he was someone who had many possessions. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Amen, I tell you that it will be hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of the heavens. And again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to enter in through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God." But on hearing this, the disciples were greatly astonished, saying, "Can any of them then be saved?" And looking directly at them, Jesus said to them, "For men, this is impossible, but for God, all things are possible." By the way, there's a translation question around the camel entering the eye of the needle, disappointingly, because it turns out that the word camel was camelos, but the word rope is camelos. So it may be that it's harder for a rope to enter in through the eye of a needle, which makes more sense, but is more boring also. So we hope that the Lord was talking of camels in that particular. If he wasn't, he should be. So again and again, you can't read the New Testament without hearing Jesus endlessly saying you have to walk away from the world. And he's not just talking about money, he's talking about leaving behind whatever attaches you down here into this machine world all the time, endlessly. Walk away from the world, he says, give everything up, he says, follow me, he says it to the fishermen who become the disciples, he says it to the man there, he says it to everybody all the time. He's an artisan, Jesus of Nazareth, isn't he? He's a carpenter. Or possibly, again, apparently another translation issue is that the translation may not be carpenter, literally it may just be artisan. So he may have been a carpenter, but whatever he's doing, it's a middle-class trade, quite a respectable one. And he walks away from that and he walks barefoot as a preaching nomad. And many of his disciples give up jobs as fishermen, which is also a respectable middle-class trade back then. They own their own boats, fishermen, they're not the poor, given up families and jobs. And he tells them to go out into the world without any shoes and be prepared to be mocked, possibly killed for what they're going to tell people, and to renounce everyone and everything but God. And it's funny, if you grew up, as I did, I suppose, with sort of Christian stories from your RE class about how Jesus is all about love and he's a lamb and he's very gentle, and you read the book of Matthew and you think, I don't know, this is pretty tough stuff here, right? Leave even your family if they get in the way, leave the dead unburied, hate worldly things, turn against your own parents if necessary. There's a narrow path. It's difficult preaching, actually. It's really hard because it isn't possible for me to look at that and not see that I'm being told to leave everything behind, leave the things of the world, whatever that quite means, because you can't follow this way home if you're kind of burdened with all this stuff. St. Basil the Great puts it like this: I do not fear exile, for the whole earth belongs to God. I have no possessions. I do not fear death, for it will reunite me with God. And that's how the early Christians actually tried to live like that. Again, there's a very interesting essay by David Bentley Hart. Again, it's called Christ's Rabble. And I really recommend reading it. You can find it online. And it's just about the life of the early Christians and how different they were to us, and how strange and threatening we would find them if we met them today. And he says the first converts in Jerusalem after the resurrection, following these teachings, as the price to becoming Christians, sold all their property and possessions and distributed the proceeds to those in need, and fed themselves by sharing their resources in common meals. To be a follower of the way was to renounce every claim to private property and consent to communal ownership of everything. You will own nothing and you will be happy. The original Great Reset, except which, as a side issue, by the way, how blasphemous Klaus Schwab and his gang are by using the language of sharing and love to promote rentier capitalism on a global scale. Well, that's another talk which I'm not giving now, so I must discipline myself. So this kind of observation is what leads to the way the early Christians lived, and it's what led to the flight to the desert, and the desert fathers and the desert mothers, and it's what led St. Francis of Assisi to strip himself naked in the square and say that he was leaving his wealth behind despite his parents' horror. And it's what leads the monks of Mount Athos today, and the sisters and the brothers of any Christian denomination who move into a monastic life to renounce the world still. And it's also what I haven't done at all. Not that I want to get confessional, but this is the question for me. What does this mean, and how do you do it? Now, because I used to be an environmental activist and I used to write about nature a lot, still do, because actually, like Nicholas Black Elk, I feel that the presence of God can be felt very deeply in the natural world and creation, if you like. Some people say to me, they say, "How you're a Christian now, so how is Christianity going to help us save the planet? Or how can religion help prevent climate change?" That kind of thing. And there are a lot of variations on those questions, and they come from people with different concerns in politics. They might say, how is your faith going to help create social justice? Or how can Christianity preserve our threatened culture? Depends who you're listening to, what questions you hear. But they all sort of start from the assumption that this religion, or any religion, is a kind of instrumental thing, that it sets out to achieve these worldly ends. Because this is a modern culture, and in modern culture we always want results, and the results have to be measured, and you have to be able to put them on a spreadsheet. We want everything to have a material goal, and we have to be able to justify the purpose of everything, including being a monastic or being religious in any way. We have to justify everything to the secular world. And I don't see that in the New Testament, actually. In fact, I see the opposite of that. I see an endless litany of repetition that the secular world, or the modern world, or even some parts of the religious world perhaps, are going to really stand against you if you try and follow this path, if you try and do this stuff. And I think that's more and more obvious the way the more the world becomes secular and modern and technological. It's increasingly becoming radically anti-religious, not just irreligious, but radically anti-religious, and in the West particularly anti-Christian. Because I think the world wants Christians to join it. That was always the warning from Christ. The world wants Christians to join it. Religion, or religion, real religion, is a threat to the machine. It's a threat to the modern setup, actually, I think. And so you can be religious, but only if you sort of play the game, if you play politics, if you use your religion for political ends, promoting growth and progress, saving the planet, being liberal, being conservative, achieving status and influence, whatever it is. Caring for the world's good opinion, which is the one thing we're instructed not to do, and the one thing I'm always doing, actually. I'm standing here now caring for your good opinion. If you all booed me, I would probably be rather upset. Which is, I don't know what I'm supposed to do about that. Just please don't boo me. But I think we're supposed to make the faith worldly and unthreatening and appealing, but I don't think it is any of those. It's not worldly or unthreatening or appealing, because no true religion is going to be any of those things. And so you have to somehow live in the world with this understanding. And this is where I wish I'd become a Christian 30 years ago, so I could have worked all this out by now. Because the instruction I'm seeing in here is you reject the world whilst loving the people in it. And if you want to save your life, you have to be prepared to lose it, and you have to carry a cross, and you might be nailed onto it. And in orthodoxy, they call this dying to the world. Hence the name of this little outfit in America, Death to the World. Death to the world is the goal, and that doesn't mean hatred of the world. It's the opposite of that, but it means rejecting it, or rather rejecting the world whilst trying to love the people in it. And it's the opposite of what we're offered by the culture, because the culture offers us self-affirmation, narcissism, pleasure, achievement of set goals, measurable material outcomes of all kinds. Doesn't matter what your politics are, what you do, that's the setup. Whatever you do has to fit within that setup. And that's why, and this is something I used to write about as an environmentalist, our attempts to save the world are complicit in destroying the world. The giant, supposedly carbon-free technologies that we're using to destroy the natural world are actually part of the problem. We use the same mindset to try and save the planet that we use to destroy the planet in the first place, which is the mindset of technology and control. Machine thinking, if you like. And that makes renunciation a radical act, which is what the guys at Death to the World say, actually. They say Death to the World is the last true rebellion, which I like, the last true rebellion. Because this Christianity thing that I thought was a load of boring old stuff that Vickers did 100 years ago, this is a radical faith, actually. It's a really radical faith. It's not radical politically necessarily. It's radical spiritually. It's radical and dangerous to this world, dangerous to the machine, because it tells us to try and follow the will of God rather than our own. And the whole world tells us to follow our own. I find it really interesting to look at a list of the 7 deadly sins from the Western Christian tradition and say, well, these are the things we were expected to avoid. Now every single one of them has been commercialized. Seriously, get yourself a list of the 7 deadly sins, and you will see that every single one of them is sold relentlessly on the internet for money every day, and you are encouraged to throw yourself into every one of them, because following the passions, as the Orthodox Christians call it, is it's where the money is, where the clicks are, the passions. And so Ohiyesa, this Native American Christian, was right. Black Elk was right. If you actually follow Christianity, it offers you a path that is the opposite of what this destructive machine thing is doing. The opposite. A polar opposite, actually. And so, although I'm a very new Christian, I am somebody who's been a spiritual pilgrim, I suppose, for at least a decade, and I am somebody who's been a writer for nearly 3 decades. And I think now, after all of this, after angsting myself to death, you can ask my family about that as well, angsting myself to death about how to save the world, or what to do about it, or how to live through it, I think there's only one way out, and that's to walk home towards God. It's just to follow the will of God as far as you can work that out, and to shed everything you have to shed, whatever that is, to do that. I don't say that with any relish. I have to say it would be much easier to go to the pub. But we have to shed our will, because our will is what's done all this. Because the world is groaning under the weight of our will, I think. Now, again, in the green movement, there's used to be a lot of talk, probably still is, about how we need a new religion for the age of ecocide, a new religion for the age of destruction and things. And I spent a bit of time thinking about this too, because obviously I knew that the old religions were useless now because they were so human-centered. And there's a lot of talk about this. We need an earth-centered sort of 21st century eco-religion, if you like, to bind us together and heal the world, as if we could just sort of invent a new faith out of cloth that made sense on paper. And people have tried. But I think you don't need a new religion because you've already got one. Because actually everything you need is there. It's in the way. It's already there. The story's been told. The visitation has been made. The work has been done. It is accomplished. Okay? Be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. My favorite line in the whole Bible. Be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. If that's true, I don't need to give any more talks, do I? The tradition's intact. And if you follow it, if you follow the way, if you follow this, there won't be any climate change. There won't be any ecocide. There won't be any empire. There won't be any of these things. Now, of course, most of us don't follow it most of the time, but at least we know what it is. We know what it is. Now, I'm talking to myself here. I should just, I'm pretending to talk to you, but I'm talking to myself because these are the choices. It's the cross or the machine. This is how I see it. It's the cross or the machine, because the machine is us, and the cross is God. So the path of the cross is thy will be done, and the path of the machine is do what thou wilt, as Aleister Crowley had it. Do what thou wilt and harm none. As the witches say, and I'm speaking as someone who used to be a witch, so I would know, right? The Desert Fathers knew it, all the saints knew it, all the Western saints, all the Eastern saints. St. Francis knew it, Tolstoy knew it, Gandhi knew it. He wasn't even a Christian, but he was inspired by a lot of the teachings of people who were. And Simone Weil, the French mystical Christian, knew it. Simone Weil, who could never quite persuade herself to join the church, but could never quite keep away from it either. Simone Weil says, whoever takes up the sword shall perish by the sword. And whoever does not take up the sword or lets it go shall perish on the cross. Those are your two choices. You can perish by the sword, you can perish on the cross. One of those things leads to life and the other one doesn't. And I lie awake actually regularly thinking, you know what, I'm a lot closer to the rich young man than anyone else in the New Testament. Actually, I am the rich young man. I'm not really rich by worldly standards today, but at least not this culture, but compared to most people in the world, I am. And compared to most people in Jesus' time, I am. So I like to pretend that I'm Saint Anthony the Great, but I'm the rich young man. I'm not sure what to do with that. But I want to end on one thought about it. My sort of way through this. And it comes from this place that I live in Ireland. Now, I moved here 8 years ago, and we live in County Galway. And if you'd asked me why I moved here, I'd have said, well, my family and I, we wanted to leave Britain, and we wanted to give up our jobs, and we wanted to have a small holding, have some land and homeschool our children and change our life and be self-sufficient. And couldn't afford to do that in Britain. In England, you have to be a millionaire to live simply. Just for the record, you can do that because you can't afford a little cottage in an acre of land anymore, but you could here. So this is why we came here, and that was a true answer. It was a correct answer, but it wasn't the whole answer, because I think now that actually we all came here to learn something about God, and we came here to find it in place. Because Ireland is one of the oldest Christian countries in the world, certainly one of the oldest in Europe. Very ancient Christian land, the first land outside the Roman Pale to be Christianized, one of the only Christian countries in the West, certainly, that was Christianized with no bloodshed, no dead Christians, no dead pagans. St. Patrick does it mostly on his own. St. Patrick, the world's first slavery abolitionist in the 5th century, manages to abolish slavery amongst the whole of Ireland because of what he taught them about Christ. It's a very old Christian land, this. It's really old. Now, I know that some of you know a lot more about that than I do, but you can feel it here. You can feel it in the holy places, and they're still here. Whatever the people of Ireland may have turned away from the church or turned away from Christianity, or wherever that leads, you don't give up on a 1600-year-old tradition just like that. It doesn't just go because you want it to. there's something in the soil that's ancient, and I think because it's ancient, it can teach us something. One of the reasons I could talk all day about why I became orthodox, and there are rational reasons for that, and then there are the more important irrational ones that are about prayer and where I was led to. But if I wanted to argue, I would say at the heart of orthodox theology is the notion that God is both immanent and transcendent. And you don't get much of this in Western Christianity, or at least you don't get it very clearly at all. The God I thought I knew when I was taught Christianity as a child was sort of up there in the sky somewhere, and if you did what Jesus told you, he wouldn't send you to hell after you died. It's not a very appealing picture, and I don't think it's the story that ever actually was being taught, but it was the impression you got. That's certainly from school anyway. But God in the Orthodox faith is immanent and transcendent, which means he's everywhere all the time, as well as being essentially unknowable too. So that means you can see, obviously, you can see God through Christ, you can see God in every human, and you can see God in everything else that's alive, because God is in everything. It's in the words of a common Orthodox prayer, everywhere present and filling all things. And it's not paganism, it's not nature worship. You're not saying creation is God, but you can experience God through it all the time. And when I look back on my life, I can see that's what was happening to me as a child when I walked in the mountains. That's what happens to me when I go out into nature. I was having religious experiences all the time and didn't know that, but I was. Because God's in the wind and in every birch twig and in the summer swallow and in the walls of Priory, and God is here in the room and in each of you, and maybe I suppose he's even in me, which is a humbling and terrifying thought, because the kingdom of God is within you. You know that. But it does mean that I feel that the kind of renunciation that we're called to do leads you right back to the place you're in, and the place you're in can lead you back to God. It's not the only thing that can lead you to God, but it can. And I'm really struck by how the really holy figures in the Christian tradition have a deep connection to God through creation itself. And I'm going to read you a little quote. I received this book, this mysterious book. It's called Precious Vessels of the Holy Spirit, The Lives and Counsels of Contemporary Elders of Greece. It's a lovely book. It's about teachings of fairly recent Orthodox saints. And I attend a monastery, an Orthodox monastery down in Shannonbridge, which is a very recent monastery, the first Orthodox monastery in Ireland for 1,000 years since the schism. So welcome back. We're coming for you. So I didn't mean, I take that back. I repent that comment. But in all seriousness, the Orthodox monastery is a rather beautiful place. But they got a package for me, the nuns at the monastery, and they phoned me up and they said, "What's this then? Someone sent you a book via us." And someone has sent me this book. I don't know who it is, and I don't know how they knew to send it to the monastery or anything, but I don't know. They sent me this book, and I read this book, and it's pretty beautiful. But here's a quote that really stood out to me when I talk about experiencing God in creation. This is a teaching from Saint Joseph the Hesychast, who's again a very recent Orthodox saint, and he was a real hermit. He did gather pupils around him eventually, because holy men always get pursued and have to teach in the end. But he lived in great seclusion for a long time on Mount Athos, which is the 1,000-year-old monastic republic in Greece that is the heart of the Orthodox mystical tradition, and spent all his time out in nature, praying kind of deep Orthodox prayer. And he says this, I really like this. He says, after spring, it's beautiful here, from Holy Pascha until the Feast of the Mother of God in August. The voiceless theologians theologize the beautiful rocks and all of creation. Listen to the wild boulders, those secret and silent theologians, while they develop deep thoughts for you and guide you, mind and heart, to the Creator. If you reach out your hand to a little plant, it immediately shouts loudly at you, "Ah, can't you see me? You hit me." Everything here has a voice. And with the blowing of the wind, as they are moved, they join together in a harmonious musical doxology towards God. That's not far from Black Elk, is it really? That's pretty much exactly the same thing. And as I say, this is not the worship of the earth, it's the worship of the Creator through creation. I don't know who said it. It might have been another Orthodox elder, St. Paisios, or it might not have been. I found this quote and then I forgot where it came from, but he said, "Earth is not our mother, she's our sister." I really like that. The difference between a pagan worldview and a Christian worldview. Earth is not our mother, she's our sister. So if you're called on to die to the world, I don't think it means to die to the earth, because I think the earth and the world are not the same thing. I think the world is the human structures and the culture and the politics and all of the stuff that we attach ourselves to. But I think that creation itself, you can still experience God within it, however fallen it is. So when you slough off the world, you still have the earth. And I have an instinct to somebody who's a very new Christian, but also a very old kind of earth lover, I suppose, that this is a way of navigating it here, because the earth, the place here, has been so powerful for Christian mystics and monks and those who decided to leave the world. So many saints in this land just died to the world. They went into the cave, they went onto the islands. And the truth came through them, and it's still here. One of my favourite saints is St. Coleman MacDhu. He's a saint from the Burren, saint from local saint in County Galway, near where we live. And St. Coleman went off and lived in a tiny little cave, which was just about big enough to sleep in the Burren forest. I've slept in it myself, actually. It's wet. And he lived there. He lived there for 7 years in this beautiful place in the forest, and there's a mountain, a spring that comes out of the mountain, and the holy well. And he built a small church there. It's very early, it's the 6th century. He lived there for 7 years before he was called out by the local king. He said, please come and build a monastery here, because we need the holy men to build the monastery. He came out and built this monastery, Kilmacdu, which is still there, has the tallest round tower in Ireland, actually. And the story goes that St. Coleman had 3 animals living with him in the cave. He had a cockerel, a mouse, and a fly, okay, his pets. And the cockerel would wake him up every day on time for prayers. The mouse would bite him if he went to sleep during his prayers that he'd just been woken up for. And the fly would walk along the lines of the Bible so that he could read the verses properly. There's another story which is slightly sadder, where his pets died in the end, as animals will. And he wrote a letter to St. Kieran, his friend, and he said, I'm a bit sad about my pets dying. And St. Kieran said, that's because you haven't died to the world properly. They were strict, these guys. Okay? No mucking around, no sympathy cards. This is like, no, you don't even get attached to a fly. Okay? You've got to stay in that cave another step if you need. That's how it works. The Desert Fathers used to say, stay in your cell and your cell will teach you everything. Stay in your cell and the cell will teach you everything. And if you look into the lives of these early saints, and not just here, but all over these islands and everywhere else in the deserts of Egypt, we have saints here like Coleman and Kieran. We have saints in Britain like Aidan and Cuthbert, and all these saints from the early years of Christianity. There was no Orthodox Church or Catholic Church or Reformation. It's the church. It's the same church. And they have this threefold movement, if you like. They die to the world, they retreat, they go out into the wilds. The green desert, they called it here because they were copying the Desert Fathers. They used to call this the green martyrdom, going to places like Coleman's Cave, the green martyrdom. You go there until you really died to the world, until you didn't even have attachment to that mouse that walked along, that bit you. And then there would be an initiation. This is what the life of St. Anthony tells us happened to St. Anthony in the desert. There's an initiation. God initiates you. And then someone comes in from the world and drags you out again. This is what happened to St. Anthony. He spent 20 years in a tomb in the deserts of Egypt praying until eventually he was initiated by God. He finally got to the point where he was so dead to the world that he was nothing but a channel for God. And then the people busted down the door and dragged him out and said, we need your wisdom. And he had to teach from that point onwards. And the same thing happened with Coleman. He was dragged out and he was made to found this monastery, or Saint Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, who lived on Inner Farne, and he used to pray all day long up to his knees in the sea, freezing with otters playing around him, and he never wanted to leave. And the King of Northumberland came and begged him to leave, and he was so upset at the idea of leaving, he was in tears. And he prayed to find out if this was God's will, and he decided regrettably that it was, and he had to go off and become a bishop. But he came back to the island to die. So you have this sort of threefold movement, as I see it. You go to die to the world, then you get initiated in nature, and then you return. So sort of death, rebirth, service. And I think that in those caves, in the land, is the lesson about renunciation, which is how I'm seeing it, because it's still there, in the holy wells all over the land. So many holy wells near where I live, and in the holy islands, in the Inishkialtras, which I probably pronounced totally wrong. Sorry to the Irish speakers. But in the oratories and on the holy mountain, on Croagh and in Skellig Michael and in the woods and under the crags, and that's Christ in the land, and that's Mary in the land, and they don't go away just because you stop paying attention. In the water and the wild, to quote Yeats again, that's where it all is. It's still there. So even sort of small worldly Christians like me, who like talking more than we like actually practicing, can go to these places and we can leave the world behind and they can show us how to do it. And so there's a sense, in my mind, that you have to go back to go forwards. Maybe you have to go inwards to your inner self, to your inner cave, to go forwards. But if you can go to the mountains, like St. Patrick did, you can find, I don't know, you can find some great mystery, some great energy, some great spirit there that can show you how to leave it behind, because it's still in the land waiting to be found. I think that's what Ireland can give to the world, and if England can ever remember what it was, it can probably give that to the world as well. It's still there. Still there. It doesn't matter. Remember, the machine will never triumph. The machine looks like it's everywhere now, but it's not. It's quite a thin layer of this crap we've built up over the last 100 years. It's not going to last when it starts to fall. I'm a writer, so I write a lot. 10 books I've done so far, and all these words, you come out with all these words, and in the end, they seem like they're not pointing you towards anything, and that's why you have to sort of cut through them. There's a famous story about Thomas Aquinas, great Western theologian, wrote so many books, so many arguments, so much theology, and at the end of his life, he was serving the Mass, and he had this huge mystical vision, this huge vision of God. Never told anyone what it was, probably because he couldn't explain it, but he said, "The end of my labours has come. All that I have written appears to be as so much straw after the things that have been revealed to me." So that's my career up in smoke. So stay in your cell, inside, outside, and maybe if you go up onto the mountain, you can leave the world behind, and maybe that's how we can learn to die to the world. I don't know, but I think so. I think so. I think it's still in the places waiting for us. And I think I knew that long before I was a Christian, actually. And then I came to Christianity to learn that through the way, through the faith, through the truth, through the things that have been revealed. And that comes to this land 1600 years ago with one of the greatest early saints, who's a saint that belongs to all Christians, whoever what church they're from, and indeed everyone who's not a Christian. Doesn't matter, does it? St. Patrick. And I thought I would end, since I've been talking too long, I'm going to end by reading, this is the greatest prayer of this land. Loads of you will know it. And it's a prayer, but it's a charm, and it's a spell, and it's an incantation, and it's a poem as well. It's St. Patrick's breastplate. And so it would be appropriate to finish on it. I don't think I'm really qualified to read it, but I will. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. I arise today through the strength of Christ's birth with his baptism, through the strength of his crucifixion with his burial, through the strength of his resurrection with his ascension, through the strength of his descent for the judgment of doom. I rise today through the strength of the love of cherubim, in the obedience of angels, in the service of archangels, in the hope of resurrection to meet with reward, in the prayers of patriarchs, in the predictions of prophets, in the preaching of apostles, in the faith of confessors, in the innocence of holy virgins, in the deeds of righteous men. I arise today through the strength of heaven, the light of the sun, the radiance of the moon, the splendor of fire, the speed of lightning, the swiftness of the wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me from snares of devils, from temptation of vices, from everyone who shall wish me ill, afar and near. I summon today all these powers between me and those evils, against every cruel and merciless power that may oppose my body and soul, against incantations of false prophets, against black laws of pagandom, against false laws of heretics, against craft of idolatry, against spells of witches and smiths and wizards, against every knowledge that corrupts man's body and soul. Christ to shield me today against poison, against burning, against drowning, against wounding, so that there may come to me an abundance of reward. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. Amen. Thank you.